Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of our Hackolade tutorial. In this episode, we'll be talking about something that we've treated a number of times before, being the functionality that we have in the Hackolade Studio around naming conventions. Please do take a look at our documentation page, which is extremely elaborate and very, very detailed, and also the really nice and short YouTube video that we've created as well for you. But today we'll be treating this as a little bit of a tutorial, right? So we're going to be explaining some of the concepts to you, and then at the end we'll also do a short demo. Right, so let's take a look here. Naming conventions, this is something that we have had in our product for quite some time. And it's the functionality where you can maintain both a business name and a technical name for your modeling objects. Right? This is obviously the case because these business names allow you to have a much more user-friendly and understandable explanation of what it is that we're actually modeling with, what it is that we actually mean with the data that we are trying to represent in our data models. Right? Technical names, for example, might use abbreviations or some kind of a case alteration that might fit the technology needs. Right? Some technologies have a need for shorter naming or for a specific layout or whatever it might be, and so therefore we try to facilitate this in our Hackolade Studio by enabling these naming conventions. Right? You don't have to use this. This is clearly optional. If you don't enable it, then business names are going to be used as the technical names during our forward engineering steps. Right? But you can, using this functionality, automate the synchronization of both these names based on parameters and or an optional conversion file. And we'll discuss this in a lot more detail now. So you have different options that you can apply here. You can either disable this, which is the default, right? Or you can basically say the business name is going to be synchronized with the technical name, or the technical name is going to be synchronized with the business name, right? So in the other direction. When we do reverse engineering, we assume that the physical target that we are deriving the model from is already containing the technical names and that these would be transformed into business names. So clearly you need to think this through and you need to think about the direction in which you want to synchronize your naming conventions, but all of this is facilitated through our tools, of course. And you can configure these tools by going into the options dialog of the Hackolade Studio. So go to Tools, Options, and then Naming Conventions. And to enable the naming conventions, you simply have to change the default name coupling from no to business to technical. This is the most common scenario, obviously, where you have a conversion going on from business names to technical names automatically. The other direction, from technical to business, is very much more uncommon and not often used, but it's there for completeness. And then you should realize that the rules of the naming conventions are executed in descending order in the options dialog. So first we do the files conversion, which we'll get to in a minute, and then we do the vowel removal, the invalid character removal, and we also do the case conversion. You should also understand that sometimes some of these rules interact, right? So if you have a space mentioned in the invalid characters, then that will mean that there's going to be some impact on the case conversion, because in a case conversion we sometimes use spaces to introduce underscores or whatever, and that will obviously no longer work when spaces are removed. And as we will show you later, there is an optional conversion file that you can use, right? So it's a CSV file with three columns, so the business name, the technical name, and the optional description, where you can basically apply this to your specific business environment and have our tool understand how you want the business name and the technical name to be related to each other using this CSV file. Right, so it's a really convenient way to handle, for example, domain-specific or customer-specific or application-specific abbreviations. And you can just use your favorite text editor or a code editor or even a spreadsheet program to edit this file. Please also realize that the conversion file works at different levels, right? So we start with individual words, but then also matches for combinations of individual words or combinations of different words in the file, so phrases really. Hackolade first matches the phrases and then matches the individual words, which is a very powerful way of working and works with many longer phrases. Obviously, there's a good example here. It might mean that, for example, a customer and an account could get converted into a simple abbreviation, but that the customer checking account and the customer account would get a different type of conversion depending on the entry in the file. You should note that the conversion parameters that we have configured in the options pane are specific to each target, right? This is logical, right? Because some targets, for example, don't accept uppercase, or other targets recommend a particular case, or typically use a particular case, right? Or have different valid and invalid characters, right? So the naming conventions are going to be specific to the target that you are going to be working with, and you will have to configure this in this options pane. And as we will show a little bit later, you can actually export and import these configurations really, really easily from our tool. So every time that you change something to the configurations, the tool is going to ask you, would you like to apply this? Would you like to specifically make the changes, make the naming configuration permanent to the names that are specifically coupled, or to the entire model that we have in front of us? And this is interesting because that means that we have a manual way that we can say, well, these names are going to be coupled and these are not, right? This is something that you configure in the properties pane, right? This is where you can have 3 states for the relationship between your business and your technical name. You can say, they are independent of each other, there is no relationship. Or you can say the business name is leading, so you convert the business name to a technical name. Or alternatively, and lastly, you can say the technical name is leading, and that means that the tool will convert the technical name to the business name, right? Typically, we would say, you would organize your name coupling at the model level. But as you can see here, with the pressing or unpressing of the equal sign next to your properties, you can do this as the individual level. And that is why you had that option here in the applying changes dialog, right, where you can either apply it to the coupled names or to the entire model. What's important is as well that you understand how the tool behaves during the reverse engineering process, right? If there is no coupling, then all the business names or the object names of the source are going to be stored in the business name property, right? If there is either a business to technical or a technical to business coupling, then the object names from the source are going to be stored in the technical name property, right? Which is logical, right? What we read in the target, what we read in the reverse engineering target is going to be your technical structure. Right? And we will then convert this to the business name using the conversion parameter. Note that you also want to take some care here. When you, for example, set the coupling to no, that will, for example, clear all the technical names. It allows you to maintain the business and the technical names on an individual basis, right? But it will also potentially clear the technical names, and you need to handle this with appropriate care. So with that, I propose that we switch to a short demonstration and try to explain some of these concepts with the demo. Obviously, there's a lot more material in the documentation online. So let's take a look at this and give you a little bit of a taste of what these naming conventions look like in practice. So I have my Hackolade Studio right here, and I'm going to give you 2 scenarios. One scenario where I will work with an existing model, right, and I will apply naming conventions to that existing model, and another one where I will be reverse engineering a new model that doesn't exist yet, and we will see how we can apply those naming conventions there. So just to give you a little bit of a feel here, right, so you go into the options, you see the naming conventions pane right there, and you see that the naming conventions are specific to the application target that I'm working with. And I'm also going to be working on business to technical name coupling, right? So these are the names that will, tie the business names to the technical names. The reverse is very much possible, but it's much less used. So we'll work with the business to technical coupling here. And we'll be using a specific conversion file, right, which I can show you right here. It's a very simple file structure where you have the business name, the technical name, and the optional description, right? You can see how the alignment happens in this CSV file. I'm using Visual Studio Code here to edit this, but you can edit this in any text editor or spreadsheet editor that you want to work with, right? But you see, I have a couple of definitions here, right? So business name account will have a technical name called ACCT. Customer will be CUST. You see this, right? So, but I also have some more complex business names here, like customer account will become CST ACC. And as explained previously, this is a sequential set of rules that is being applied here, starting with the individual words, then with the phrases, and then potentially with combinations of those as well, right? So let's go in here and also realize, I have the conversion file. I'm going to be having some display options here. I'm not going to remove vowels, that's very often too confusing. I have some invalid characters here, but note that there are no spaces in here, it's just to avoid confusion with some of the case conversion settings over here. Note that I can export these options, right? So the definitions of how my naming conversions work, I can export them, and so I can also import them so that everyone in your organization would be applying the same types of naming conventions. So let's go into a particular model here. I'll work with this particular MongoDB model that I have over here, and you see, the business name has been filled in here, but the technical names are not yet filled in. So I can go into my options here, and I can go to my naming conventions and say, why don't you refresh this? And then it will ask me, if I would like to apply these naming conventions to the coupled names only or to the entire model. When I do this for the entire model, you can already see that the ship name has been converted into a technical name here. The equal sign means that they are tied together, right? And I can no longer edit this, right? So if I want to click on this, then all of a sudden I can edit this, but that's not what I want in this particular situation. So now that we have this first iteration of our naming conventions in place, right? We see them right here, popping up over here on the right-hand side. You will also realize that I can illustrate this even better by just quickly going through this manually here and adding another property, right? And I just want to quickly remind you that over here in my naming conventions file, I have an account entry, I have a customer, so account gets modified into ACCD in the technical name. You will also see that the customer gets translated into CUST, but that customer account gets translated into CST ACC, right? Remember that? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a property here to this orders collection, right? I'll do that right now, and I'll actually show you how this naming convention gets activated in real time. So if I do customer here, you see it popping up, it becomes cust. If I do account, it becomes ACCT. But if I do customer account, it becomes CST ACC. Right? So this is exactly what I've got over here in my naming conventions conversion file, and you can see it live while I type in the model over here. Now I can also undo this really, really easily. If I basically set this to and then say, do you want to apply this? Then it will ask me if I want to clear the technical names again, so that I can potentially correct some mistakes or whatever. But be careful with that, right? You don't want to be making inadvertent changes there. So this is the example of an individual model that we are editing here, right? So I'm not going to save this, and I'm going to switch to a reverse engineering example, right? I'm just going to quickly check and make sure that the naming convention settings have been set already, right? Because when I do the reverse engineering from the existing MongoDB instance, I want to make sure that it will actually create not just the technical names, but also the business names. So let's go in there and reverse engineer the target, MongoDB target from Atlas. It's going to connect, and I'm going to choose the right one, do the inferencing of the relationships. When it does this, then you see that it's going to ask me a question, whether I want to reverse engineer the source attributes as business names or as technical names, right? And, depending on what I choose here, there will be different behavior. The natural thing to do would be that the Atlas instance actually contains the technical names, right? Because that's what is being stored inside the database, right? It's not the business names that are stored, it's the technical names. So this is the more natural thing, but you can choose both. And now what's going to happen is the naming conventions that I have specified will actually be applied. So that means that genres all of a sudden has a business name associated with it that is capitalized, right? Same thing with this technical name, mflix, whatever it is, right? It's going to get capitalized, right? So all of these things are now applied as we have specified them in our naming conventions, right? So this is another great example of how you can create these business names from an existing database using reverse engineering. So with that, we're going to wrap up this tutorial on naming conventions. I'd like to invite you to take some of the reading material on board, the documentation, our blog, obviously the fantastic book that we have published together with Steve Hoberman and Daniel Kupal about MongoDB data modeling and schema design, very, very useful. And then of course our socials, and yeah, why don't you try it yourself and download the Hackolade Studio for free. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.